Tandem Nomads, episode 166.
Even if it's Time magazine or the New York Times or the Washington Post or any one of the big names, maybe it helps to know that they are actually looking for people like you to write for them, because it's not very obvious. Actually, they are looking for writers and freelance writers.
Hello, Nomad Nation. Welcome to Tandem Nomads, the podcast show and entrepreneurship platform where you can find great inspiration and tips to grow a successful portable business and thrive in your global nomadic life. This is your host, Anel Deregi. I'm a business and marketing coach and the founder of Tandem Nomads. One of the great ways for you to be able to get more visibility, attract more clients, and grow your business is to be featured in the media. You can either be interviewed, but another way to do it as well is to actually submit your articles to platforms such as online magazines as well as print magazines. So writing is an amazing way for you to be able to get published and to find exposure for your business. And this is what we're going to talk about today with a very special guest, Olga Mecking. Olga, are you ready for this ride?
Oh yeah.
I'm so happy to have you again in the show. Just in few words, Nomad Nation, Olga Mecking comes from Poland. The first time she moved abroad was to Canada, where she joined her German boyfriend at the time. They then moved together to Germany, and marriage and 3 kids later, she now lives with her family in the Netherlands. So her journey started when she decided to blog and share her journey with parenting abroad. And that is when I first interviewed Olga on Tandem Nomads podcast show to share her journey of being a blogger, as well as being featured for the first times in online blogs and magazines for her writing. But since Olga has been on an amazing journey, and this is why I wanted to bring her back to share with us all this amazing growth that she has been experiencing since. So Olga Mecking is actually a writer and a journalist. And since her last episode in the Tandem Nomads podcast show, her articles were published on the BBC, The Guardian, Washington Post, New York Magazine, and the Pacific Standards, and many, many other platforms. And one of the great things about her story was also, on top of it, one of her articles was featured in the New York Times magazine and went viral, which has then led her to also publish her book called Nixon, The Dutch Art of Doing Nothing. So Olga, what an amazing journey since the last time we talked, isn't it?
I'm really surprised at what happened. And when I look back at the last podcast, it's like I'm at a totally different place right now. It's very weird.
It's very inspiring. So I'm really happy to have you back here to share with us what has happened since and what has triggered you to be where you are today. So I want to talk a little bit about your book also, because it's a very interesting concept. But before that, if you could just try to remember where you were before when you were still having your blog. You don't define yourself as a blogger anymore. You define yourself as a writer and journalist for other news platforms, and mediums. But I would love to know what has happened. What has made that shift for you? Or you decide to say, okay, I don't want to blog anymore, have my own blog, but I want to write for others. What happened for you to get there?
So yeah, I actually closed my blog maybe a year ago. Yeah, and I just have a website, an author's website, which is olgamecking.com. And I think when we last talked, I was already starting being published on parenting blogs and magazines like Scary Mommy and Mama Load and others. And I just kind of continued doing that more and more and more, and I blogged less and less and less. And because one of the things I noticed was that blogging was great, but it was also unpaid. Lots of time spent on crafting articles, finding pictures, sharing it everywhere, and my audience was never very huge. So at that time I thought, okay, I kept my blog for as long as I wanted, and when I noticed that I was starting to make money writing, I kind of kept it up for a while because I wanted to have something just for me instead of, writing for others, where you have editors, which is of course great, but they want you to have a special voice that fits into the magazine. And I wanted to have something just for me, just when I could write whatever I wanted. But also blogging was changing, so you couldn't just write a story, put it up on your blog. You had to kind of do SEO and do pictures and picture in 3 different formats for 3 different platforms. And something that used to take maybe a few minutes or maybe an hour to do, it just started taking so much longer, and I was getting very annoyed by that.
Yeah.
So kind of stopped blogging and just focused on the writing. Also because, as I said, my audience was never big, but New York Times, Washington Post, all those platforms have huge audiences. So why would I try to keep up my own tiny blog where I could get in front of those spaces?
And I think what makes it interesting in your case, so Nomad Nation, when I started this introduction, I was talking about writing as a way for you to be able to have exposure for your business, but writing itself can be a business and a source of revenue, like in your case, Olga. So real quick, do you think that there's a big difference between pitching when you have your own business and you just want to share your expertise, or pitching to be paid?
That's a good question, because it's actually very important to editors at publications, whether you're trying to promote your business or whether you're an expert writing a story, because it's also visible in the payment. For example, I know friends who had books out and they wrote lots of stories to promote their books, and then they were not paid for those stories because it was, they could promote their book that way. Whereas when I just write a story about something that maybe doesn't have much to do with my book, then I can kind of, I'm not thinking that far yet, but because now I can just pitch stories and get paid for them. But as soon as you're trying to promote something, that becomes very tricky.
Yeah. So it's just that you either get paid by getting exposure or you get paid by money. I think at the end, that's a little bit the different angle. But I think the method of pitching is not that different, is it?
It's not different. In fact, you have to be careful as a writer to use like some experts say, be careful with using the word pitch, because our people also write pitches, only they write things like, oh, would you like to interview my expert so-and-so for your story about, I don't know, business?
Yeah.
Whereas a writer would say, I have a story about business and I'm actually a businesswoman myself, and this is my expertise and this is my idea and this is why it's so great for your publication. The difference is small, but it's there.
Yeah. So you think that publications are more interested in real experts who do have something to share when they pitch, instead of being indirectly pitched by other people?
Yeah, I think it has to do with ethics and journalistic standards. Because from my experience, they do have interest in writers pitching their stories. And it helps if you're an expert in something. For example, if you're a business writer, or if you're a parenting writer, or if you're kind of a combination of both or something else. That's really helpful. Once you have a product you want to sell, that's becoming trickier.
Yeah, definitely. It's a different angle that you want to bring. Yeah. So let's start with I'd love to do like a move backwards. Let's start with the present and then move a little bit backwards. So could you tell us the whole story about how you went from pitching the article to the New York Times to writing your book and being published?
That was a whole big story. So I read a little story in a totally unknown Dutch magazine about, and it was called Nixon, or Doing Nothing is the New Mindfulness. And at that time I was so annoyed by all those wellness trends telling us to do more, or maybe you should be more mindful, or you should you should buy more stuff, or you should eat healthier, or you should, I don't know, it's whatever it is, it's all very time consuming and exhausting. And then you have to do it of all areas of life, right? So I was so annoyed by it. And then I read this article and thought, oh yeah, actually, why can't we do nothing? Why is it not okay? Why do we have to always be doing stuff? And then I pitched it first to a fun, quirky magazine called Woolly. And they loved it, and it did really well for them. And then after a while, I found out that Smarter Living, which is a New York Times section on, I think the name says it all, Smarter Living, on how to live a better life, healthier, more productive, more creative, or just better, smarter. I knew the editor was looking for pitches. And I sent them a similar idea. And what they do is they have lots of, because there are different types of stories. And for Woolly, I wrote a trend piece. So I said, basically, this is this new thing, and it's pretty cool, and it has benefits. And and maybe a little bit at the end, here's some advice on how to do this. But for Smarter Living, they want what is called, so they do lots of how-to stories. So how to do this, how to do that. And for them, of course, I wrote a how-to story, how to do nothing, with lots of advice.
That's amazing. Just the title, How to Do Nothing, is just so tongue-in-cheek in a way. And how can you give tips on how to do absolutely nothing?
I know. And it was actually called, eventually it was called The Case for Doing Nothing. And of course, so lots of advice. And I said, I sent him an email saying, okay, this is my idea. I've written about it already, and it's still pretty, and it's done really well for Woolly magazine. So would you be interested? And the first thing he did, he said, well, maybe not today. No, so the first time he responded, he actually rejected this idea. And then a few months later, he comes back to me with an email and said, hey, can we revisit this? And I'm really grateful to him, because that's the first and only time an editor went back to me on a story they rejected and said, okay, maybe we can do it now.
Amazing. So, I want to unfold all of this a little bit before we move forward into the story, because it doesn't end there. So I was paying attention to what were the triggers in this story. And I've heard a few things, and I would like to see with you if you agree. The first thing that I noticed is that you were paying attention to the trends. What are the trends that work for magazines and what they're looking for? Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
That's one of your key secrets in a way to be published.
Yeah, definitely. At the time, I did not know it was a trend, because the first mention I had of Nixon, it was in this totally obscure magazine that no one outside of the Netherlands ever heard of, and it was in Dutch. So I think it was very important that it's that I could read Dutch.
So I see. That's interesting. But that leads me to the second one, which I notice also about you in general, because I know I follow you, but especially here in this story, is while you know the trends, you also come with something that comes cutting the edge, where you're here to be able to kind of say, hey, there's another angle to this. For example, you said, I'm tired of all of these mindfulness stuff that just add more tasks to my crazy day of raising my kids, having a business, and dealing with everything. And now this whole trend of mindfulness that's even adding more pressure on me to be a perfect mom, perfect person. So you've been kind of just taking that opportunity to create a new discussion around a topic that's trendy, which I think that's also another thing that made it interesting.
It's true. I do like writing stories that are kind of going against the grain a little. So one story I did, for example, was, you know how usually it's women following their husbands abroad?
Mm-hmm.
So I turned that narrative around and wrote a story on men following their partners, their female partners abroad.
Mm.
Or there were so many stories on along the lines of why I don't share pictures of my kids on social media. And I wrote a story like that, but my answer was not because, and it's usually the answer was usually because of privacy, because I want my kids to be anonymous. I want them to make their own choices where they're gonna where their pictures is going to be shown. And I said, okay, I'm not sharing my pictures of my kids on my social media, but not because of privacy. It's because it's my social media, and I have my kids at home every day, and my social media, my Instagram is just my space.
Mm-hmm.
That's why my kids are not there.
So interesting. So Nomad Nation, I do think that there's something here interesting to dig into deeper into finding where can you bring a new, fresh look at a topic where you can really be heard because you just bring some fresh air in this conversation. So I love that about you, Olga. Another thing I've heard in what you said was the fact that you knew who were the editor and that when they were looking for something. So how do you do that? How do you know who to pitch and what they're looking for?
Yeah, so there are several ways to do that. One big resource I use is Facebook groups for writers. And you have many of those groups, and editors are there too. So they're gonna say things like, oh, I'm looking for this magazine, I'm looking for stories about this. And once you know an editor is looking for a certain type of story and she's giving you her email address, then it's so much easier to actually, even if you don't have the perfect pitch yet, it's actually easy to reach out to her and say, hey, this is me, I have this idea, are you interested? Another place I use is Twitter. You'd be surprised to hear how many editors are actually actively looking for pitches on Twitter and sharing their email addresses in their bios.
Fascinating.
Third place to look is, of course, Google, as always. You can Google stuff like how to pitch X publication, or submission guidelines and publication name, or or you can just look around the website of the magazine you're interested in, and a lot of the times they'll have a page about us or our team or our writers, and many of those will share the email addresses on there as well.
That's amazing. So it doesn't seem to be that complicated at the end.
No, it's actually, I think it's if you don't know those resources, right? You're kind of here and the magazine is there, and it seems like there's no bridge between those places. And maybe you have an idea, but you don't know who the editor is, and maybe you know who the editor is, but you don't have their email address. And I think with each one of those hurdles it becomes harder, and then like, oh no, I'm not doing that. But once you have the idea, and if you can get the email address of, and once you find out who the editor is, and once you find out their email address, then pitching them, you have all the information necessary, and emailing them is so much easier.
Yeah. So we'll talk about how you actually pitch. How does it work? But before, you mentioned really good tips here. Go to groups, go to Twitter, and simply Google who is the editor. Usually you find those contacts there. Would it be possible to share some examples of groups that we could put in the show notes of this episode?
Yes. So I guess the Binders is a great group.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are several others. That's the one I use the most. And there are several newsletters. Sonia Weiser, I think she's called. I think it's called Opportunities of the Week, run by a writer and editor, and she just browses Twitter and she puts all those calls for pitches together in one newsletter, and she sends it out every week.
So, Nomad Nation, we're going to put a lot of resources for you in the show notes of this episode. If you're interested to check them out, go to tandemnomads.com/166, and we'll put all the resources there, including a great resource that Olga is preparing for you, which is some examples of pitches that she's made, the most successful ones, that you'll be able to download on this page. So go to tandemnomads.com/166. So speaking of that, you've been so good at sharing with us how to find who to pitch, but then once you find their emails, what are your tips to be able to make a good pitch?
Yeah, I just remember one thing about like being unique. Like we talked about finding a very unique angle, and especially that Tandem Nomads audience is quite international. I think it's, for example, for me, it was very helpful that I live in the Netherlands, and I wouldn't pitch the most obvious stories. No, the one that make news headlines every day. I think it's kind of more interesting and also to the editors to find stories that aren't widely read. That's why it's a good idea to try to find local publications that aren't very known, and then try to browse them for stories and pitch them to bigger ones or international ones. For example, for The Guardian, I wrote a story about neighborhood walks, which were happening in not exactly my area, but close. And there were people meeting up every 3 months to kind of walk around their neighborhoods and seeing what's missing or what's gone wrong and try to fix that. And it was published in The Guardian, and no one else found out about it because I took it for a hyper-local The Hague publications. So I think as experts, we're really well placed for those kind of stories, because the New York Times will have journalists in place, or stringers as they're called in the Netherlands, who will look for the big stories. So try to find the things that they were gonna miss.
That's so good. That's such a good tip. That's so smart. Yeah, definitely. Like, how can you be unique is by not going with the trends and finding the things that other journalists cannot find on their own. So this is so good. I have the feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, that it seemed like when you get published in a local news or a smaller platform, you can still repitch that story to a bigger platform. Is that feasible?
Well, there'll be yes and no. So I wouldn't pitch. When I said, look for local publications, look, just read them. Find out like a hyper-local newspaper in your area, and then see if there are any stories that you might pitch to bigger places in the US, for example. I know there's some. So I know I've had my stories republished. That I published them in one place, and then suddenly someone writes me an email. I read your story on so and so, and it was totally different place from when I originally wrote it for. So it does happen, but I think it has to do with some kind of contracts and agreements that publications have with one another. I wouldn't really pitch the same story to two places twice. What you can do, for example, I took the Nixon trend, right? And out of that, I did two stories, one a trend piece, one a how-to guide. So you can always
shift it a little bit.
Find a new angle, or try a different tone, or instead of a feature, write a list, or instead of a list, write a essay, personal essay.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So I get the point. That's why I was a bit surprised. I was like, would a newspaper accept to take a story from somebody else? Because that wouldn't be okay, I think. So it's more about, if something has worked somewhere, you can just change a little bit the angle so that you can legally also, in terms of rights, be able to sell it to somebody else. I will talk about contracts a little bit later. Maybe real quick, are there any type of contracts that you sign when you get published, or how does it work in terms of rights?
It works it varies. So some newspaper will require you to sign off like your home, your soul, your firstborn, or maybe not as that. They want they might want exclusive right to the story. And it always helps to look for language like that, because you made, like, if you write something and it does really well and you get a book contract, right, then you might not be able to, because of that kind of part of the contract where you said, oh, actually no, we want the whole right to the whole thing. So it's, and remember, the contract is another thing you can negotiate. So you're gonna probably negotiate your fee, but you can also negotiate your contract. So if you don't like the language used, you can ask to be changed. Although I did have a story that I wrote for a magazine where I asked, okay, you want exclusive rights, so doesn't mean that I've been never able to write about this again. I said, no, actually, the story as it's published with our edits and stuff, that's ours. But I can use my original story, the way I send them, in some other form, in a book or in a different story. So it always helps to ask about it. Some agreements I've had were just emails. So the editor says, this is your deadline, this is your fee, this is your word count, and that's the contract basically.
Wow,
And
interesting.
I've had to sign like big pages of documents. It's very, very different. It
Different
depends.
from So how did you get to? Did you just learn on the tarmac, like it's in French, or did you have to actually reach out to some lawyers or get any trainings to learn to do this properly, so that you don't get? Was it just something that you learned by doing?
The contracts. No,
Yeah.
sometimes if I'm really unsure, I would have it read like by my mom, for example. She's not a lawyer, but she's super smart, so she gets stuff like that. If there's something wrong, she would notice.
Yeah. So getting a second opinion of somebody who might have some knowledge would be good. Ideally a lawyer, but if you can't really afford it, try to get as close as you can from somebody who can read it for you and make sure that you're not doing anything against your
And you can
interests.
always ask your editor, because they'll, sometimes it's just obvious to them, oh, this is the contract we send out to everyone, and it might not be as obvious to you, and I'm sure they'll be happy to explain this to you. So that's why.
How about the fees? How does it work? How did you know the worth of your writing? That must be like such a jungle in terms of pricing. So what can you give us to guide us through the pricing of, if somebody wants to actually, instead of getting featured to be featured, if somebody wants to be paid for the writing, what can you share about that pricing?
Again, it depends it depends on the publication and on type of story and your experience. So to give you a idea, I was paid anything from $0 to $1,400 per story. And the way it works is that every publication has a different rate. And sometimes you can negotiate it and sometimes you can't. So, but always try to negotiate the price. It's always good to do that. The worst they can do is to say no.
That's true.
Yeah, so you can try that. But then those big numbers can also feel very, wow, that's a lot of money, and it is. But if you had for example, the New York Times story that went viral, it was 1,200 words, and I was paid $1 a word, so $1,200, which is of course a lot of money. But I had to interview 5 sources for that story, and I did. And then the editor told me to interview yet another source. So that, imagine how time-consuming that is. And he was right, of course, that he told me to interview that additional source, but it was even more time-consuming. And transcribing interviews, either you do it yourself, which takes forever, or you pay money to someone to do it for you. Either way, your hourly rate with such a story wouldn't be so fantastic.
That's such a good point. It's, if you try to make it for money, you need to figure out that. But I think the more you do it, the more you get a sense of it. So if you're just starting out, in a way, you need to go through that to be able to figure it out, right?
Yeah, and of course, the more experience you get, the easier it becomes.
So what the initial question that led us to all these sub questions was, once you find the editor, how do you pitch the person to get featured? So what are your tips here? What are your, so just you kindly offered to share with us some examples. So Nomad Nation, as I said, go to tandemnomads.com/166, and Olga will share some examples that you can download. But if you could just give us some tips of what are the strategies that you have to be able to catch editors' attentions to say yes.
Yeah, so a pitch is, it sounds a little bit scary. I didn't know a pitch. What kind of word is that? But it's actually very straightforward. So it's, or you can call it a query if it's easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's an email where where you introduce yourself and say, I'm a writer living in the Netherlands, like I do, for example, and say, I have this idea for your magazine, and it's about, and then you describe it in a paragraph or two, and you try to explain why this idea is important right now. The timely hook is pretty important for some magazines. Why is it important right now? Or why is it a good fit for the magazine? And why are you the best person to write it?
Mm. And you managed to do that all in a very short email, or is it, how long are those emails?
No, so pitches are short. Like, of course, this will depend on the on the type of story. But if you're writing, I don't know, 1,000 word story, then you're not going to spend a lot of, words on the pitch itself. So my pitches are usually 300 words long. If it's for a feature, sometimes. When I pitch an essay or an opinion piece, then I probably going to do something like the first paragraph. I'm going probably to share the first paragraph of that story. So because it's important for the editor to see what kind of style you have. And it also, sometimes you're not going to pitch, you're going to write the story first and then send it off to the editor. And that's exactly in the case with essays and opinion pieces and humor pieces, because those are things that are very voice led. So you might have the best idea for an essay and then your voice doesn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
And the editor will have to check if your voice kind of works out in the story. So, for example, I had an essay published in the New York Times as well, under that's the well section. And I wrote it first and sent it off, and it was accepted. And if it's a story that requires sources, for example, or if it's a story where the idea is more important than the way you write it, then I pitch. I also try to pitch essays and opinion pieces because I don't like writing something only to have it rejected. It's not nice. And then a pitch is much less of an effort.
Yeah.
As opposed to a whole story.
What shows, what I love about your story is how you're self-taught. You really take the time to actually do the research and learn by doing and by trying, and eventually also by failing. I'm sure that you had much more pitches than
Yeah.
stories who've been, so you just don't give up, you just kept going at it and put some time in it.
Yeah, but mostly it wasn't okay, it was more this curious thing of, okay, I can blog, can I write features? Okay, now I can write features, can I write essays? Written an essay, can I do this, can I do that? I was always kind of curious. I wouldn't say I saw it as a game. But it was a little bit playful. Can I do this? Can I do this? Oh, I can do this.
That's so cool. I love that. I absolutely love that. So many great insights. Thank you so much. I think we're not done yet. That's the thing. I have so many questions for you, but I still want to go back to the initial beginning where we said we stopped at the fact that you got featured in the New York Times with the story of how to do nothing, basically. What was the article's title in New York Times?
The case for doing nothing.
The case for doing nothing. So what has happened once you got featured?
So as I said, the editor rejected it, came back to me and told me to interview like 5 people, which I did. And then he told me to interview someone else. And the rewrites, the edits were pretty intense. So that's something you have to be prepared for. It will also depend on the editor and on kind of your level of experience and how tired you are, for example. So I know when I'm tired, I'm gonna make lots of mistakes, or I'm gonna write, I'm gonna miss some things, or maybe and I'm actually pretty happy to be edited because I'm not a native speaker of English. So anyone who takes time to read my writing and correct it and help me learn to do better, for me and then pays me for for learning that, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that's such a good way to look at it. You're so right. So you got featured, and then where did the book come in? How did that happen? The article went viral online, and then I think they printed it, if I remember well.
Yeah, they did. I asked the editor if they're going to print the article out, and he said, sometimes we do, but we're not planning it for this one. And then it went viral, and he sent me a PDF of the printed story.
That's so good. You must have been so happy.
Yeah, I was pretty amazed, and also because when the article went live, I was on vacation, so I couldn't even do much. And then suddenly Nixon was everywhere, and everyone was writing about it. And but I think in July it was everywhere. By July it was everywhere. So from May till July.
What do you mean by it was everywhere?
Everyone's writing about Nixon. So Time magazine wrote about Nixon, women's magazines wrote about it. And then from the US, it kind of came back to the Netherlands, and the Dutch press started writing about this. And then it went kind of all over the place.
Actually, let's explain a little bit the word Nixon. I forgot to explain what it means. What does Nixon mean?
It means doing nothing. It's the Dutch word literally doing nothing. It's like the verb doing nothing.
So, okay, so it went picked up by a lot of other magazines. So how did the book and the publishing came in? Well, what happened?
So for a while I was thinking, oh, maybe because I knew writers who had books, who got book deals after having a story go viral. And I was wondering, oh, would it happen to me? But I was actually talking to those writers or other writers, and they said, oh, you're going to have to query agents, and it takes forever, and it's so much work because you have to put together a proposal, and a proposal is basically to a book, like a pitch is to an article. And you have to do this and that, and it takes ages. And I thought, maybe I'm not going to write that book. Because it just seemed too much work. And then
especially for a book that's about not doing anything.
Exactly. Yeah, so writing about nothing is actually hard work. Then my publisher actually reached out to me and asked if I was interested in writing a book about Nixon.
So how did the publishing company hear about you, find you? How did that happen?
They must have followed the Dutch press somehow, and maybe they're probably looking at trends, right? And what's being written about this particular trend. And by July, Nixon was everywhere. And they must have found all those articles, so who wrote it, and then that led them to me.
Excellent. That's amazing. So they came to you and offered you to write this book.
Yeah, and then I also had interest from an agent in the UK about the same topic. So it was tricky. It's a wonderful problem to have, obviously, but I had 2 very different options that would lead me to 2 very different outcomes, because the publisher does one thing and an agent does another thing. And in the end, I went with the publisher, and I'm very happy with this. So
that's excellent. How did you make that choice? What helped you decide?
I met with the publisher, I met with the agent, and listened to what they told me. And I thought, okay, what do I want? Because with the publisher, because they're Dutch, I was a little bit worried that then the book would be published in the Netherlands only and wouldn't make it outside, like it wouldn't make it outside of the Netherlands. Whereas the Nixon trend, it was actually happening in the US. So it was very important to me to get in front of an American audience.
Mm-hmm.
An agent could help me do that because they were very international and had a very good foreign right department. But then with an agent, I didn't had the guarantee that it will sell it to a publisher. So both very different options with very different outcomes. And in the end, I said, oh, okay, maybe I want the book published. I don't want the stress of uncertainty of maybe it wouldn't sell at all. And that's a risk, of course, always. But with a publisher, at least I'm going to have this book.
Excellent. And you have them now in both languages?
Yes, so it's been published in Dutch and English in the Netherlands, and there'll be 2 English language editions coming out in a few months.
That's amazing. So how long did it take you between the article and the book being published and now out and printed and distributed?
Yeah, so the timeline goes like this. Article was published in May. By July, I was approached by the publisher and by the agent. I think I made my choice by August, probably. Started writing in September, was more or less done by December, because because it was a trends book, and they felt it was important that this book happens very quickly. So they gave me very little time to write this book, but okay, we managed. Yeah, and so it's March, and the book was out in March.
Excellent. Wow, this is amazing. That's like not even a year.
I know.
Wow. All right. So here, nomination, it just shows how, a lot of people think that you need to have a book to be able to get published. And here's the other way around, where actually by being published, you can also get some great deals to write a book, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't happen very often, but if it happens, it's pretty amazing.
Tell me more about Nixon. What are you trying to convey through this book? What is it really about besides the art of doing nothing?
Some of it is about, yes, of course, how to do nothing and what it is to do nothing. I was actually surprised how there was a lot of information about boredom or about laziness or about procrastination, but there was very little about doing nothing itself. So I kind of have to interview different people, and they all had different definitions of Nixon. And my favorite definition was to do nothing without a purpose. So if you sit on the couch and do nothing, you're not doing it because you want to be a more relaxed, calmer, better person. You're just doing it just because. Of course, there's this Dutch aspect to it. How the Dutch, who actually told me they're not doing much of Nixon because they're so busy. And it's of course a matter of perspective to someone from a different country, where there's a very strong work ethics, like the US, for example. The Dutch may seem pretty relaxed, and of course, the fact that they have a generous healthcare and social support system also plays into that. And another aspect about my book was that it's a little bit about anti-wellness, and how I was annoyed by all those, I don't know, trends about how we have to buy more and do more and always improve ourselves. So this book is also against, okay, why can't we do nothing and just accept that maybe we don't have to improve ourselves all the time. Maybe it's okay to sit and do nothing for a while. Yeah, so in the book I also write about knowing when to do more and when to do less. Maybe if you're busy all the time, maybe it's actually, time to think about it and why and how to change that. Or if you have to change it at all, because sometimes being busy is good, because being busy means having a good life full of good things, right?
Correct.
But sometimes you kind of you maybe need sometimes to do more in some areas of life. So for example, a while ago I signed up for a Dutch class because I wanted to learn some Dutch, and I thought, okay, with 3 kids and my work and then adding a whole class to it, maybe I'll sign up for the easier class. And then I found it was all grammar and book, and I was bored. So I signed up for a more challenging class. It was actually much more interesting, even if it was more work for me, right? So the important thing is knowing when to do less work, when to do more work.
Yeah.
And what kind of work.
That's so interesting. I love that. And I think there's so much we can unfold about this topic. It's a fascinating topic. Just to wrap up a little bit this great conversation, what I find interesting as well of what you're telling us now about the book and relating it to the topic of this episode, how to pitch, it's about that finding that thin line of having a very provocative title when you're actually having a more mixed message, that more nuanced message, but using a title that is really, in a way, catching people's attention, not only because people don't talk about it a lot, but as well because it's saying something that you might not want usually to hear, like doing nothing is good. This is not what you're actually saying in the book, but you bring in much more nuanced about it. But the title is what is catching people's attention and what made it viral. And that's where you have to be comfortable.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that was a big thing for me to sometimes be critical of myself. Mm-hmm. And if I write about Nixon, maybe I also want to say, okay, I'm kind of a believer in it, but there'll be moments where you shouldn't be doing nothing. Mm. And I guess also I wanted to kind of separate myself from all other wellness trends, because I've read so many of those books and they were all, you are bad. If you don't do what we're telling you, you're a bad person, a loser, a quitter. Yeah. and that makes people feel bad. And the last thing I wanted is to make people feel bad.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that.
And also for titles, for articles, we do not, as writers, we do not always choose the title. Sometimes the editors will change it because of SEO or because of other reasons, or to kind of be more in line with what their titles are usually like. So sometimes you write a more nuanced article, but it gets this very controversial title slapped on it to grab people's attention.
That's fantastic. Okay. These are really, really great tips, Olga. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your amazing journey and your great tips. Hopefully, Nomad Nation, you had taken a lot of notes. And on top of it, like I said, Olga is offering you some examples of emails that she actually sent that had led to being published. So go to tandemnomads.com/166 to be able to download it. Before we say goodbye, and also let us know where we can find you.
I do run a group called the Nixineers for people who, basically it's a group for my book. So where people can learn about it and share tips how to do nothing.
Excellent. So what's the name again of the group?
It's the Nixineers.
The Nixineers.
But for Nixon.
Excellent. I love it. So I will put the link of the Facebook group in the show notes of this episode as well. Thank you so much, Olga. This was such a pleasure to have you here and hear about your story and your great tips.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. So Nomad Nation, again, tandemnomads.com/166, and stay tuned to turn your challenges into great opportunities.